Welcome to China Manufacturing Decoded from Sofeast, the podcast where we take you through the major news and topics facing importers and manufacturers in China and Asia today.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the China Manufacturing Decoded podcast. I'm your host, Renaud Anjoran, and today I have two guests on the podcast. So we've already had Clive Greenwood a few times on the podcast, and we also have his partner, Andrew Wilson, also from WWMG, who is based in the US now after having spent a long time in China. And we're going to cover an interesting topic. In most cases where a foreign customer works with a Chinese manufacturer, depending on who has the so-called design authority, who issues the specifications and so on, where does liability actually reside when things go wrong? There's actually, we're going to talk about a big disconnect here between the expectations of the different parties. So let me kick it off by asking Andrew to cover, usually from the customer's point of view. Let's say, for example, a US company that's going to develop a new product with a Chinese manufacturer. What do they actually expect, that the manufacturer will tell them? They might maybe expect that the manufacturer is quite professional, a little bit like a US manufacturer, a typical US manufacturer would do. And is that correct? And maybe Andrew also, maybe you can start telling us just a little bit about your background.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Renaud, for having me today. It's an honor. My name is Andrew Wilson. I'm a partner of Clive Greenwood's at WWMG Associates. I've been working in China and in supply chains for over 13 years and have helped a lot of small, medium-sized enterprises in the US and as well as tech startups source and procure goods and manufacture goods in China and help structure their supply chains in China and Asia generally. To answer your question, many companies in the United States, particularly small, medium-sized enterprises and tech startups, when working with contract manufacturers in China, really expect them to understand in depth the markets that they're exporting to, and have them have a deep understanding of the regulations and the types of certifications that the product is going to need and specifications it's going to need to be met in order to be exported to that market. So many of these companies, smaller companies in particular, are very reliant on the manufacturer to provide them with the information they need to get their product through customs and to meet all, regulations of the market for that product.
Right. So, yes, it's a little bit like they would buy from an established manufacturer in the US, right? That's really the general thinking. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And so what is actually the real situation? Let's say with the average contract manufacturer in China, do they actually know the market well and what the customers can and cannot accept, and all the applicable regulations and so on and so forth?
In many cases, that is not true. That is not the case. And I think everybody on this call knows that to be true, that in many cases, they are very unaware of regulations, especially when it comes to FDA. So it's something that can trip up a lot of importers when they're importing their product, or they can receive, as you know, golden samples, and then when they get the bulk shipment, that many of those products do not meet the golden sample that they received, and are very disappointed as such.
That's so true. Yes. Clive, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, if we talk about the US market in itself, if we talk about product liabilities and liability laws, well, first and foremost, what you have to understand is that US federal law, when it comes down to product liability, there is not a US code. There is a code of practice, but not a US code as such. And basically, each state will have its own liability laws as well. But the basic concept around this is either, it falls down into three categories, okay, which is strict liability, breach of warranty, and negligence. Within those, there is three or more subclauses. One is manufacturing standards, the other one is design, and the third one, which is the one which catches many people up, is the failure to warn, which is a very wide standard. Now, failure to warn, for example, brings us to as I wrote in my last paper, which I sent you guys later. The fact is that most lawyers will tell a supplier not to offer advice, because offering advice would, in fact, provide a route for liability if something is wrong. So the failure to warn and the normal general advice is tell people what it says on the box, but make sure that that's correct. When you talk about the EU, well, that comes under a very old established law called EU 85/374 EEC, which is very clear on its power and also on its use. And that is that the person that brings the product to market is liable, and in with no limitation. So if you are an agent, you are liable to the same as what the manufacturer is. And that comes down to who they can get their hands on.
Yes, of course. Yes, much easier to grab the importer and bring them to court if it's really, really bad, rather than trying to enact any kind of judgment over a manufacturer in a very faraway jurisdiction, right? I think that's the general
when you've got joining jurisdictions, it's basically a legal mess, and it's extremely complex.
Right.
But if we talk about who owns ultimate responsibility, believe it or not, that is with whoever owns the design authority.
Yeah, that's a pretty important concept. So to make it very, very simple, there's two basic cases, right? Case number one is the buyer designs the product and gives the designs to the manufacturer for manufacturing. And in that case, if the manufacturer has to do some engineering work, it's basically under direction from the buyer. And then the opposite case, again, to simplify, is that the manufacturer owns the intellectual property of the product. Maybe let's say they developed it themselves, and the customer only purchases it and distributes it. And in that case, the design authority resides with the manufacturer, right? So in this simplified situation, case number one, if something goes wrong, manufacturer is at fault. Case number two, if something goes wrong, the customer is at fault. Can we say that it's that simple?
No. The problem comes in how each state law or national law interposes itself into the liability laws. Now, in most cases, if we took the EU case, for example, it doesn't matter who's at fault. The manufacturer will be at fault, or according to law, will be seen as liable.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
importer. Yeah.
No, the manufacturer. If, for example, that manufacturer has just been asked to design a product and sell a product, the design authority can still remain with the overseas client, shall we say, or the person who's paying for it, as in paying for it to be manufactured. If the point is, if that person has to approve any of the design, then they are liable. If they don't have to approve the design, then the manufacturer is liable.
Got it. Okay, so that's the key distinction here.
Key distinction is who is approving the design.
Okay, and when you say design, it's not just like the design files and so on. It's also the quality standard, the specifications, the testing plan.
Yes.
And most people, most companies I see sort of forget that. But the design and the specifications, maybe we should say it this way.
Yeah. Well, basically, what you've got to look at is who is doing the DFMEA and who is going to authorize the DFMEA.
So, just for the listeners who are not very familiar with that, FMEA, failure modes and effect analysis, is a kind of risk analysis, and the DFMEA is a design. Basically, is a risk analysis on the design. Unfortunately, it's not. In many cases, especially in consumer goods, there is no such analysis. It's really a pity. But as Clive and Andrew work a lot on medical devices, yeah, it's sort of a must there. Same thing in automotive and aerospace,
aviation,
and so on.
Aerospace, and telecoms as well, by the way.
Okay. Okay. So what you are saying is that at the time of the evaluation and risk analysis on the design itself, the party that does that risk analysis and then they're supposed to take some actions, put some controls in place, maybe change the design and so on to keep the risk down to a level that they deem acceptable. And finally, there is a residual risk, right? And then they have to think, okay, when it comes to potential quality issues, when it comes to potential reliability issues and so on, we still have this residual risk. What do we do about that? And maybe that's when it comes to the obligation to warn, as you said earlier, right?
That's right.
They might put it in the labeling and the user manual and so on.
Yeah.
So
the concept would be, of course, that the manufacturer, as Andrew clearly says, that the manufacturer is deemed to have general professional knowledge of the product which he is supposed to be making. That does not alleviate the failure to warn, and it does not evaluate failure to meet with compulsory standards. However, if the buyer, for example, tells him, don't worry about it, it doesn't make any difference because that will increase the cost, then they are doubly liable, because then that could be actually classed as reckless endangerment. And that would, in the States, that would come under federal law and probably put them directly into strict liabilities. The use of breach of warranty is when a product would fail before its intended or designed failure dates or numbers of operations. Right.
So it's a typically reliability issue.
Typically reliability, yeah.
Or it could be a quality issue, meaning coming from poor manufacturing rather than poor design, but then it would be caught pretty early. And it might still come under warranty. But these usually come in the first couple of months after.
Now, an interesting point here, Renaud, is that when you're talking about the design, you're also talking about the component and the component design as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Picking the right components is part of the design. Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
that's right. Now, many many buyers rely on the contract manufacturer to work with their upstream vendors to supply those components.
Right.
Which is basically, this would come under the general professional conduct or general professional knowledge defense. But the defense to general professional knowledge is extremely weak if you have not done a documented QMS on this.
So okay, so let me get back on this, because it's Andrew put the finger on something quite important. Yes, very often the buyer, even if they design the product, will leave some of the work up to the contract manufacturer, including working on the BOM, the bill of materials, picking some of the components. Maybe the buyer picks some of the critical components and leaves all the rest to the manufacturer. And when it comes to screws and cardboard and things like that, that probably makes sense. But in some cases, they pick the display, the battery, things like that, and that's when things can really go wrong. And same thing actually on the engineering design. Sometimes maybe the buyer would work on the firmware and the software in the app. Let's say it's an electronic product, and maybe they would do the PCBA schematics and layout and all these things, but maybe they leave all the mechanical engineering work to the manufacturer, or the opposite. And in that case, same thing. They actually they count on the manufacturer to do that work, and they hope that the manufacturer does it well. But to make that even worse, and that's why we talked about a big disconnect earlier in the episode, to make it much worse, in China, very often the manufacturer will not charge the buyer for that, or will not charge the full amount that they should charge for that work. However, they believe it's their their intellectual property, and they do not share it with the buyer, which means the buyer has a hard time actually doing a proper risk analysis.
That's right. Or auditing those upstream component suppliers, which put them at risk.
Yeah, if you look at it from my world, then in that case you are looking at something which is totally uncompliant.
Yes. I mean, if the buyer doesn't have the bill of materials, doesn't have the design files, their technical folder is pretty weak. It's
useless. It actually wouldn't be accepted.
Yes. The problem is that in reality, when you look at the way a lot of companies work, that's the sad reality. They have some of the information, but not all the information. So in that in that
case, they cannot conduct their requirements under statute laws.
Yes.
Right. So if something goes wrong, they really have no defense, right?
They have no defense now.
Is it because you mentioned negligence? Would that be called negligence or something else?
It could be argued to be negligent, yes. It would depend on the severity of the occurrence. If, for example, somebody is physically hurt, then it is almost likely that that they would be facing a negligence charge, yes.
Right. And that means in case it's a pretty serious issue, maybe some people were injured or worse, or it costs a lot of money to one of the customers, they could end up in court and they would be in a pretty bad position. Is that correct?
Yes, because the defense of negligence has to be that you can prove that you have conducted all and necessary due diligence and risk assessment on that product.
Yes.
It doesn't say you've just got to have a look at it. This is when you're going to need to present all your your technical files, all the product development files to show that you have considered this at every stage. If you haven't done that, then you have no defense.
Right. So, and the worst case is, all these small companies that started to be Amazon sellers and that went on Alibaba and picked some, a nice product and, please make it in that shade of green and with my logo, and here's a nice packaging that I designed, and then they start to sell it. And some of these products, electrical, are for kids. they might come with pretty serious safety issues. Some of them might be used for detecting an illness or things like that, or curing. So they might be considered a medical device, even though they're not aware of it. So these people are just distributing a product, and they have zero technical information about that product. So these people are putting themselves at serious risk. Is that correct?
They're putting themselves at risk of jail. Let's not mince words here. EU MDR 2017 is very clear on how it distinguishes medical products, and it's quite wide. I mean, a class 1 medical product, for example, is, an IIR mask. Okay, it requires an a CE safety standard, and that CE safety standard, for that to be now valid, it has to be, if it's a new product, it needs to be compliant to EU MDR. If it's an older product, I would say, which is, say, 3 years old, then it still has to be compliant to EU MDD, but EU MDD still requires.
Yes, a lot of this.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, it still requires this. So there is no aspect, and this is why people have been caught out with providing masks, for example, with ear loops, and there is not a single ear loop design which is compliant to these standards. And let's be right about this. Not one is compliant.
Right.
Now, if you move down the higher level of technologies towards class 2, class 2Bs, as you know, I work with class 2B products, the design file that you need to submit is extensive on the extreme.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And you have to have considered, and you have to prove that you have considered, and you have to prove that you have done the tests. Now, as Andrew says clearly, if you are a startup company trying to move into this space, there is an enormous, rightly so as well, an enormous cost which has to be incurred. Now, from a compliance point of view, if you cannot afford that cost, you shouldn't be making that product, and you sure as hell should not be supplying that product to a regulated market.
Oh, yeah. No, definitely. So, yeah, when it comes to anything that comes under the definition of a medical product, definitely there's a very long process. It does cost a lot of money. And it will take a long time to put it on the market in a compliant way. So that's clear. If you provide automotive parts to General Motors or Volkswagen, same thing. You're gonna have to follow the advanced quality planning process. And you're gonna have a PPAP to follow and things like that. It's gonna take a while. Also, it's gonna take a lot of engineering work. Okay, let's go back to more general consumer goods. Some of them, as I said before, are electrical. Some of them are for kids. Some of them are maybe for use in a critical application somewhere in the field for a business customer or utility customer and so on. When it comes to these products, they might not be regulated as tightly as, let's say, medical products. However, let's try to give a few action items to companies that are starting to design such a product, right? And they want to make sure that they have all the design files and so on. They have to make sure that they have an idea about the risk and that they do the right testing and that they keep all the right records and everything. So where should they actually start? it's it's going to take them a while. It's going to take a specific budget. Would you recommend, in general, that they go to a Chinese manufacturer, early, and that they start working with that Chinese manufacturer on the development? Or
No.
would you suggest that in general? Yeah. So what would you suggest?
Well, the first thing I would always recommend is that the very first action should be a post-market surveillance report. Sorry, a pre-market surveillance report. That's the first thing. And in that, you're going to find out exactly what standards the product is going to be applicable to.
Yes.
Without that, you don't know where you're going.
Right. Initial planning, right? The initial
planning start. Part of your pre-market surveillance will be, and that's quite easy. You can look around and see other products which are of a similar type, shall we say.
Right.
And say, right, okay, this standard, this regulation, or this directive will apply to this product. And at that point there is where your design would start.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
What about also looking at maybe customer specific requirements and things like that, right?
That's part of your pre-market surveillance. Yeah.
Yes. At the same time. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that file is quite extensive. I sent you a copy of one the other week. Our post and pre-market surveillance processes.
Yeah.
At that point, when you know this, you can start the conceptual design.
Mm-hmm.
When you have the conceptual design and you have got at least an understanding of what regulations are going to be applied to the product, at that point then is when you could engage a supplier. Because part of that surveillance that you're going to have to do, this is even before you get to the point of asking for requests for quotations, you have to have the product very well designed or defined, should I say, in terms of regulations and laws and applicable standards before any type of pricing can begin.
Yes, definitely. And not to mention that you might have to work with certain types of manufacturers that have certain certifications, and you should definitely avoid talking to anybody else. Yeah.
And you should certainly verify that those certifications are legitimate through various government online websites, and verify that those certifications are real.
Yes, because if those certifications tend to be not real, it's irrespective of who was at fault. If a product went wrong or went to error and caused injury, for example, and the investigation showed that the people that you bought this from or the people that's made it for you do not have the necessary certification and authorities, that's bad.
Yeah.
If you find out that you've been given a certificate which turns out to be not correct, being kind, you would be liable, not them.
So before you start exchanging any kind of information with new suppliers or anything in the details anyway, do your due diligence, right?
Do your due diligence. Do your supplier quality management actions.
Right.
Spend the money to save you a lot of pain in the long run.
Oh yeah, because I think it's pretty clear. We can say that picking the wrong supplier will be extremely damaging to the project, to the point where the whole project might fail, or it might have to be restarted 1 year later or 2 years later after a lot of money has been thrown down the drain. Would you say that?
Yes, or you could be faced with a complete product recall as well.
Yes, if you actually go through production and put it on the market. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
And that could cost thousands and thousands and thousands.
Right. So if I recap, first do your initial planning to know what regulations or standards apply. Make sure you know exactly what the requirements for the customers, for the users and so on will be, and then do, as you say, the conceptual design. What are the features going to be? How actually would it work? And I would say, as much as possible, do all the initial design yourself, because when you're developing the conceptual design, that's really not the strength of the manufacturer. When you it's much better to work with a good industrial designer, make sure it looks good and can work as it's supposed to be. It will force you to clarify so many of the specifications and the details of the product and things like that. And manufacturers are really not experts. They really can't contribute much to that. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Absolutely, I would. Yes.
Then, go ahead.
No, please, Renat.
Oh, so and then, as you start talking with manufacturers, do your due diligence carefully before sharing anything to them. Obviously, intellectual property, there are some legal tools that you need to use here to make sure that they are bound to confidentiality, non-use, non-circumvention, and so on. Make sure if they start to do some of the development work, also that there's an agreement on that, and who will own the resulting IP, whether you can pull the molds, if there's some tooling, for example. There's a lot of considerations here. Maybe we don't need to go into that, but if we stick to product safety, let's say you're doing some development together with the manufacturer, what do you need to do? I think it's pretty important to have a pretty clear plan for the verifications and validations, the different types of approvals that the product design has to go through before you even think of going into manufacturing.
Absolutely, there is, yes, and that's why an understanding of the state laws and regulations and directives is important, because that is where you're going to define your route to market.
Right. Yes. So if the applicable regulations do force you to have certain types of approvals, of course you have to do that. But let's say you're designing a product and there's no such stringent type of regulation when it comes to design and development. They don't really force you to do anything in particular. And you look at ISO 9001, it also leaves you a lot of freedom, right, on how you're going to validate and verify that the product meets the intended usage and the requirements from the customers and so forth. So what would you say are the most basic?
Okay. Yeah, the first thing to notice that if a product's going into the EU, it will have an EU directive. No matter what it is, it will have an EU directive, that is for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And within that, remember as well, the subcomponents within the product, which is where things tend to fail coming out of China, is that the actual subcomponents will need to meet a certain standard, which means that they will still need to meet a certain performance standard. Now, the question is, when you're designing that product, are you giving them the manufacturer, for example, are you giving him what the performance requirements are? And in many cases, not. The individual component performance.
Right. Yeah, you have to translate it into, hey, look, for example, REACH will apply. So all the components that go into it must not have more than that much content of all these restricted substances and so on and so forth. So
Correct. Yes.
Maybe it makes sense to work with REACH certified sources to start with. Yes.
Well, I mean, a classic example is steel. if you look at steel standards, steel have a molecular makeup, and that grade of steel will have a range of carbon, of sodium. When you analyze that, even though you will get certificates that says it meets this standard, when you take that piece of steel and actually put it under an electron microscope or whatever, you find it doesn't. This is common.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, extremely important. Yes.
Yeah. This happens a great deal. This happens a great deal in automotive manufacturing, by the way. A great deal. Okay. Now, the question is, A, how did that happen? And B, okay, yes, you may have caught it, or you may have not have caught it. What happens then? What you have here is obviously a warranty liability, because your warranty is now useless. Okay.
If the steel doesn't have the right physical properties, then you might be in for a pretty disastrous kind of failure.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Now, the question before us is, who is liable? It's clearly not the design person, providing the design person has actually told them that this must be. And a lot of this case, Renaud, is on the wordings of contract. So a very clear statement and a very clear contract which says that this will be to this standard is important. Now, if that happens, that you have clearly said, this is why you would have a PPAP, for example, or certainly the AQPQs, which would define what it can be. Now, if it's not to that standard, unfortunately, the manufacturer, if they own the design, is still liable. Okay, under EU law, he's still liable, and same as well under US law as well, because that comes under failure of manufacturing.
Right. Okay. So that's really related. Basically, everything that you've told us so far is that the specifying, the requirements very clearly and very well is really extremely important, because then you know what to request from the component suppliers, from the manufacturer, and so on, and you actually already know how to test it. Would you agree with that?
Yes, because if you know this is your only defense against product liability.
Right. And when we say requirements, so again, they can be about the components, maybe the grade of steel or the amount of certain substances that they have, and maybe their physical properties and so on. It's about the manufacturing process. It's maybe about the design of the product itself when it comes to reliability. Is it going to withstand all the stresses during the expected lifetime? Without leading to certain kinds of failures that are related to safety. It's very, very wide, right? So obviously we cannot cover that today, but I'm trying to get at a general conclusion that really people can note, can record in their brains, is that if you want to have safety products, you want to avoid any, you want to reduce your risks when it comes to liability on the products that you put on your market, you have to make sure that the requirements in terms of applicable standards, in terms of everything, the use of the product, how it works, what the performance, and so on and so forth, you have to really spend actually a lot of time defining that in advance and have a very strong plan. And then from there, if you stick to your plan, and you make sure that what you required is what you're getting, then again, if your plan is good, your liability will be greatly, greatly reduced. Okay, is that correct? If I summarize it,
that's correct. That's correct. Yeah,
okay. Certainly, and a lot of that also goes with correctly selecting your supplier from the start to make sure that they have those capabilities, that they have the equipment needed to test those those functional requirements, and making sure that they are capable of manufacturing your product to the applicable standards.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, you're sort of forcing them to subcontract to some other workshops, and maybe they will not give you visibility over that. And yes, you touch on an important point. If they have the testing equipment in-house, at least for some of the tests, then that allows you to request, maybe you send your own staff to do some work there with their equipment and record the data, or you require the manufacturer to do the testing and give you the records, and then you can do these as a combination together with some external testing, right?
Yes.
So it's all about cross-checking.
Cross-checking and validating their work. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Wow. That's quite useful. I think we did a nice job of covering this topic, and thanks, Clive, for research.
No problem.
For the research you've been doing. That's helpful. and thanks, Andrew, for coming on the podcast. We'll be happy to get you back if you'd like. I mean, we'll talk about that. I'm sure there will be other opportunities. So yeah, again, thanks so much. And for the listeners, I hope that I'm sure that's been helpful. Actually, I'm pretty sure about that. I hope that you had some takeaways and some action points. You will hear from us next week in the next episode. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to this podcast, brought to you by the Sofeast Group. We're on a mission to provide you with everything you need to manufacture effectively in Asia, including inspections, auditing, new product development support, contract manufacturing, 3PL warehousing and fulfillment, and much more across Asia's key manufacturing areas. Visit us at sofeast.com, that's SOFEAST.com, to learn more and get help. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, please do rate, review and share, because it will really help others discover us too.